Put yourself out there, just speak, don't be shy, all of this stuff. And that's all very well and makes perfect sense if you are that way inclined. But if you're at all like me and you identify as an introvert, or at least have very strong introverted tendencies, that kind of advice is very, very difficult to take. Welcome back to the StoryLearning podcast. My name is Ollie Richards. This is the place where we talk all about language learning. And today we're talking about introversion. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but so often the advice you see around language learning always seems to be geared towards extroverts. Put yourself out there, just speak, don't be shy, all of this stuff. And that's all very well and makes perfect sense if you are that way inclined. But if you're at all like me and you identify as an introvert, or at least have very strong introverted tendencies, that kind of advice is very, very difficult to take. So the question comes from @quietlyconfident, who actually left this question 4 years ago, but we've dug it up from the archives because I think it's always going to be relevant to lots of people. Now, @quietlyconfident asked, could you do a video on what your introverted polyglot friends do to learn and maintain languages? Or just share the link if you've already done one. I think we have talked about introversion a lot. And in fact, I seem to remember about 10 years ago, I almost made a whole series of stuff about introversion because I'd noticed that being an introvert myself and knowing a lot of different language learners who were introverted, it really didn't feel like that was catered to at all. It just felt like all the advice that you would generally see was just not helpful. But it was more than that. It wasn't just that it wasn't helpful. It was like, if you take an introvert and you say to them, "I'll just walk up to this random person on the street and start talking," you can't imagine anything worse. You're not going to do it in a million years. And so you may as well not give that advice at all, and you've got to find a different way in. Because look, introversion can be a superpower if you know how to harness it properly. And I think the first part of that is appreciating and understanding, giving yourself permission to ignore a lot of advice out there that is not suitable for you as an introvert. And you can do that if you can recognize that this advice is probably given by extroverts to other extroverts. If you give yourself permission to ignore that kind of advice, it immediately liberates you from a lot of the pressure that you might feel to behave or to approach your language learning in certain ways. Now, one of the, I think kind of not the only conclusion, but one of the inevitable conclusions of being an introvert in language learning is that you do tend towards more solo activities. All right, so all things being equal, rather than going out there and stopping random strangers on the street to talk to them, you're more likely to pick up a book and read, right? It's just the natural tendency you're going to have. And for that reason, reading is I think it's going to be the cornerstone of learning for a lot of introverts. And so just by way of kicking us off here, I have created a little guide which outlines my 6-step reading process. It's the way that I have come to teach reading based on doing a lot of it myself and helping a lot of other people use reading and noticing where people go wrong. So there are 6 specific steps to reading and really making the most out of it. In particular, doing it in such a way that you're not always reaching for the dictionary every 5 seconds and interrupting the flow. Anyway, if you'd like to get this guide on how to read effectively in a foreign language, it's completely free. You can scan the QR code on the screen if you're watching this on YouTube, or else check for a link in the description. Kind introverts. The big 5 personality research, you might be aware of this. There are 5, what would you call 5 kind of categories here: openness, conscientiousness, agreeability, extroversion, and neuroticism. Now, introverts, the way that is defined is that introverts, out of all those different 5 types, score low on the extroversion dimension specifically, right? Now, that means that it's not necessarily shyness or social anxiety. I think a lot of the time, people think that introverts are very shy or they're socially anxious. Not necessarily. I'm not particularly shy. I'm not particularly socially anxious, but I am an introvert. And so the traits that define introverts are as follows. So you prefer smaller groups or time alone. You're less likely to dominate conversations. You prefer a slower pace in general. You prefer calmer environments. You experience excitement less intensely. not necessarily less happiness, but you experience excitement less intensely, and you are more reserved initially. So I'd be interested to know if you feel that you're an introvert, to what extent you relate to a lot of these. I relate to a lot of these, but I do think that it's a spectrum. It's a little bit like motivation. People say that there's such a thing as extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. In my experience, it's just not binary that way. You can have elements of both, and it can be a spectrum. And my experience of introversion has been like that. On the whole, I'm pretty introverted, but I'm capable of delving into extroversion territory quite readily. And so I've heard this referred to before as being an ambivert, meaning that you have elements of both. I don't know if that's a thing or not. I think a lot of people feel that it is. But I think the best way of thinking about it is that it is a spectrum. And the classic kind of things that introverts are not going to enjoy in language learning are group classes and talking to random people, whether that's in person or just talking to someone new on Zoom, for example. And for me, when I think about those sort of situations, it is the pressure that I really don't like, right? So in a group class, the fact that I have to answer the teacher and I've got like 6, 10, 12 people listening to what I'm saying, that creates a kind of pressure that is unhelpful for me and causes me to kind of shut down. It's like a kind of performance anxiety, you know? And then similarly with talking to random people, it's not the talking that I have a problem with, it's the fact that it's a random person, right, who doesn't know me, who doesn't know my situation. I think the fear that so many of us have with languages is that initial moment when you speak to someone, that's the bit that you're worried about, because you're worried about what their reaction is going to be. Are they going to think that there's something wrong with me for not speaking the language properly? Are they going to immediately switch to English and I'm going to be just really embarrassed about it? What are they going to think of me? Are they going to just think, well, why is this weird person on the street just talking to me? It's about the kind of outside judgment element that for me in particular, that I struggle with. And I think like to have a degree of control, and I like to put myself in situations where I have some kind of influence over the social setting, because that is how I can kind of come out of my shell and actually express myself properly. And so introverts, where I think they can really shine is in this introspection, and it's in the ability to reflect, the awareness of the self. I'm not saying that extroverts don't have any of that stuff, but certainly introverts tend to be a lot more conscious, a lot more self-conscious, right? A lot more conscious of how they're behaving, of how they are seen. And if you can harness this can be a real superpower. So the kind of things that introverts should probably lean into in order to become fluent in another language is, first of all, to recognize that if you are uncomfortable doing things like group classes or just speaking to people you don't know, well, just stop doing that. I give you permission to stop that. Creating safe speaking environments is absolutely key. This is advice that I often give regardless of extroversion or whatever, but finding that person who you feel safe and comfortable speaking with is such a huge step in your language journey, because it just creates this atmosphere where you are now able to make mistakes without worrying about how you are seen and how people will think about you. So whether that is with a tutor that you really like, whether it's with a language exchange partner, a tandem partner, you know, someone who you meet and you exchange languages, whether it's with a good friend. I've been lucky enough to have this a few times in different languages where a very good friend at the time happened to be a speaker of that language and they didn't care about speaking in English with me, so I was able to practice a huge amount. But whatever it is, it's creating this safe speaking environment, and that's often going to be in a one-to-one setting, right, and not in groups. So if you do some of the kind of things that I've done in the past to learn languages, like sign up for a salsa class in Tokyo with 20 Japanese speakers, it can be quite intense. Rather than doing that, look for one-to-one situations, right, with tutors, with speaking partners, language exchange partners, and really immerse yourself in that. I remember when I really transformed my Japanese when I was living in Japan, what happened was I found language exchange partners who I would meet with literally every day, and I would just practice with that person who was a safe person. And it just gave me finally the ability to come out and practice Japanese, speak Japanese, experiment with expressing myself in different ways, using the language in different ways that I had in my head, but I hadn't quite got out of my mouth yet. And it was creating that environment that allowed me to finally speak as much as I needed to, and that was what really was the kind of tipping point in my Japanese. The next thing that is very useful to do as an introvert is to practice words, phrases, exchanges that are useful in the early stages of an initial interaction, right? So if you know that it is difficult for you to start interactions with people, whether that's speaking to someone on the street or having your first Zoom lesson with a teacher, you can practice and train the kind of things that you're likely to say at the beginning of an interaction. So whether that is like stopping someone on the street and saying, "Excuse me, sorry to bother you, I was wondering if I could ask you a question," right? Figuring out how to say those things in the language you're learning gives you can give you the confidence to actually start those interactions in the first place. Likewise, if you want to do more lessons on Zoom with teachers, you might like to practice the very first things that you're going to say in those interactions. That can be very, very confidence building. But then also, if you know that you're an introvert, that you prefer these solo activities, give yourself permission to focus on listening and reading. Now, I think sometimes people misunderstand what listening and reading are. They think that because they are receptive skills, because this is you receiving the language through reading or listening, that this doesn't actually help you speak. But this is not the case, because reading and listening flood your brain with information. They flood your brain with knowledge, whether that is vocabulary, pronunciation, grammar, speech patterns of speech, whatever it is. And if you spend all of your time listening and reading, you really can't go wrong, because you're going to know so much stuff over time. And if this is your natural territory, and if this is something you are actually going to do, as opposed to, the speaking on the street that you think would be nice, but you know that you're never going to do that, well, give yourself permission to indulge in that. Listening and reading are things that, I've known a lot of extroverts who are great at going and speaking to people on the street and can, talk you under the table even as a complete beginner. But they don't necessarily have the ability to sit by themselves and study for long periods of time. Right? This is the disadvantage that a lot of extroverts have. They're uncomfortable being by themselves. They are not able to sit down and study for long periods. So if you can do that as an introvert, that's a fantastic advantage. So really, really lean into that. And again, the key with listening and reading, as always, is finding material that is at your level and that you really enjoy. So in that situation, time spent really finding those perfect materials is the key. So, back to the question from Quietly Confident, what I do and what my introverted polyglot friends do to learn and maintain languages ultimately is giving yourself permission to learn in the way that suits you and not to feel the pressure to go and do things just because other people recommend those things. Ultimately, the whole point of learning a language is to use that language in whatever way that we want for our own lives, right? And so whatever that means to you, if you can define what that is, be aware of how you want to use that language, then you can just do that and be happy and confident doing exactly that. So anyway, if you'd like to do a bit more reading and you'd like to figure out how to read better, you can download my 6-step reading process. Again, link in the description there. Also, the StoryLearning app is the thing that we're developing that is really aiming to solve this problem of where do I find reading material that actually helps me learn, because in the StoryLearning app, the stories, not only do you get to pick what genres of stories that you want to read, but the stories automatically adapt to fit your level, right? So if the stories are too short, they will become longer for you. If they're too hard, they will become easier for you. When you look up and save words, we use those words to write the next stories so that those words get naturally recycled. We're working on audio at the moment so you can listen along at the same time. So basically, we're trying to create the ability to always be reading in the ideal environment. Anyway, so you can check that out as well if you would like to get better at reading. A lot of talk about reading here, but reading is it is the bomb. Anyway, link in the description there. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you back in the next episode of the podcast.